A subtle malignancy, insidious in its creep, began to suffuse the very air following the ascendance of those who sought dominion. It was not a swift, decisive blow, but rather a gradual erosion, a pervasive influence that stretched tendrils into the most intimate corners of existence. Homes, schools, and workplaces, once sanctuaries of individual autonomy, became extensions of the imposed ideology. The rhythms of life, once governed by personal choice, now echoed the dictates emanating from on high. The very essence of self-determination was being subtly, relentlessly overwritten. Decisions, once the purview of private conscience, were now pronouncements from a distant authority. What one consumed, the words exchanged within familial walls, the methods of child-rearing, the diversions pursued in moments of leisure, all were subject to scrutiny, to regulation, to the suffocating weight of external control. Individuality became a liability, conformity, a survival mechanism. What had previously been a realm of personal preference, a sanctuary shielded from the intrusions of the state, was now subsumed by the relentless apparatus of control. The air itself crackled with a palpable tension, a miasma of fear, the ever-present spectre of watchful eyes, and the relentless pressure of social expectations. These forces coalesced, shaping a new reality, a landscape where genuine expression was supplanted by cautious compliance. The tapestry of existence, once vibrant with diverse threads, was now being woven into a monochrome shroud. Survival, then, became a delicate dance. Some, driven by a pragmatic instinct, adapted seamlessly, embracing the new order with unsettling ease. Others, compelled by a desperate need for self-preservation, feigned allegiance, donning the mask of conformity while harbouring dissent in the recesses of their minds. Still others, a courageous few, stubbornly resisted, clinging to their convictions despite the perilous consequences. The very streets bore witness to this transformation, becoming stages for displays of enforced loyalty. Ubiquitous banners unfurled in the wind, punctuated by the rhythmic cadence of obligatory salutes and the chilling spectacle of public reprimands, stark reminders of the price of non-compliance. A chilling premonition pervaded the collective consciousness. No one, regardless of their perceived status or affiliations, could claim immunity from the encroaching darkness. To deviate from the prescribed norm, to exhibit even the slightest hint of nonconformity, was to risk ostracism, to be cast adrift, or worse, to vanish without a trace, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the regime. And when the drums of conflict began to resonate, escalating into a symphony of scarcity and barbarity, any semblance of stability, any vestiges of normalcy were irrevocably shattered. The question lingered, a haunting echo in the silence. What was it truly like to navigate that inferno, to endure that epoch of unspeakable hardship from within, amidst the oppressive silence, the suffocating atmosphere of enforced obedience, the insidious charade of order meticulously constructed to conceal the rot beneath? The insidious birth of the dominion, a story etched in fear, etched in silence, and etched in the indelible scars of the soul. The year was 1933, a turning point, a hinge upon which the fate of a nation precariously balanced. In January, a figure cloaked in ambition, emboldened by a thirst for power, assumed the mantle of leadership, yet his grasp on authority was far from secure. He commanded neither a parliamentary majority, nor did he possess the unequivocal endorsement of the nation's diverse factions. His rise, however, was not predicated on consensus, but on a calculated strategy of dismantling opposition, seizing control of every facet of governance, and leaving no refuge for those who dared to defy his agenda. The Reichstag fire, the conflagration that engulfed the German parliament, served as a catalyst, a carefully orchestrated pretext for the consolidation of absolute power. In the aftermath of the blaze, Amidst the confusion and the clamour of accusations, a series of decrees were swiftly enacted, granting the government sweeping powers, the authority to apprehend individuals without substantiating evidence, without the encumbrance of due process. This marked the beginning of a systematic persecution, a witch hunt directed at communists, social democrats, and any voice that dared to express dissent. Concentration camps, initially conceived as temporary holding facilities, began to swell with citizens whose only transgression was independent thought, citizens whose intellectual curiosity, whose commitment to critical inquiry, was deemed a threat to the burgeoning regime. These were not prisoners of war, not combatants captured on the field of battle, but ordinary men and women whose beliefs ran counter to the prevailing ideology. Their incarceration served as a chilling reminder of the price of nonconformity. What proved most disconcerting, what truly underscored the insidious nature of this transformation, was not the violence itself, but the alarming speed with which it became normalized, the unsettling ease with which the populace acclimated to the erosion of fundamental rights. The architects of this new order did not immediately dismantle all political parties, opting instead for a more subtle, more insidious approach. They systematically undermined each party's legitimacy, eroding its support base, exploiting internal divisions until each withered and faded into irrelevance, offering only token resistance as their foundations crumbled. Within a mere 6 months, a democratic republic, once a beacon of freedom and self-determination, had been transmuted into an autocracy, ruled by a single, monolithic entity. The transformation was breathtaking in its audacity, chilling in its efficiency. Labour unions, once bastions of workers' rights, were forcibly disbanded, replaced by a singular organisation controlled by the regime. Workers were stripped of their collective bargaining power, forbidden from voicing grievances, denied the right to strike. Any attempt to assert their rights, any act of defiance was met with swift and merciless retribution, dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. The press, the radio, the world of literature and the cinematic arts were all brought under the sway of a single, monolithic narrative. This was not merely censorship, a suppression of dissenting voices, but a relentless barrage of propaganda, meticulously crafted to present the figurehead as the saviour of Germany, the architect of its resurgence, the embodiment of its destiny. The airwaves, the printed page, the silver screen, all became instruments of indoctrination. Within the hallowed halls of academia, teachers were compelled to swear allegiance to the regime, forced to propagate its values, to instill its doctrines in the impressionable minds of their students. Children, the future custodians of the nation, were subjected to relentless indoctrination from a tender age. Those who demonstrated exceptional aptitude, those who possessed the potential to become future leaders, were funneled into state-run academies, institutions designed to cultivate unwavering loyalty, to mould them into the future architects of the party's dominion. Towns and cities witnessed the rise of youth groups, organisations that promoted physical prowess, instilled a sense of unwavering obedience, and glorified the ideals of the regime. These were not mere extracurricular activities. They were deliberate instruments of social engineering designed to forge a generation wholly devoted to the cause. Even then, beneath the surface of imposed order, the whispers of discontent began to stir, faint tremors that hinted at the coming storm. For those designated as undesirable, those deemed to be outliers within the idealized vision of the new order, the initial stirrings of exclusion were subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first tendrils of a creeping frost. The subtle shifts in societal norms, the imperceptible changes in the atmosphere, hinted at the storm to come. Individuals found themselves subtly, yet systematically, marginalized, denied access to certain professions, relegated to the periphery of public life. The subtle sting of discrimination, the unspoken prejudice, began to erode their sense of belonging, their sense of security. Those who were of a certain faith began to perceive the subtle shifts, the unspoken animosity. Their presence, once accepted as a natural thread in the tapestry of society, now seemed to draw disapproving glances, to incite whispers of discontent. They were gradually, inexorably, being pushed to the margins, their contributions diminished, their voices silenced. Opportunities that had once been freely available, positions in government service, roles in academia, were now subtly, yet effectively, closed to them. The justifications were often veiled in bureaucratic language, couched in terms of efficiency or national interest. But the underlying intent was unmistakable. The subtle signals of rejection, the dismissive glances, the unspoken barriers chipped away at their confidence, eroded their sense of worth. The right to marry those of other ancestries, once a matter of personal choice, was now prescribed, deemed a transgression against the purity of the envisioned nation. The erosion of personal autonomy, the intrusion of the state into the most intimate aspects of life, was a chilling harbinger of things to come. While the spectre of outright annihilation was not yet openly discussed, the process of isolation, the deliberate separation of one group from the rest of society, was already underway, its insidious tendrils reaching into every facet of life. The initial acts of discrimination, the subtle forms of exclusion, served as a litmus test, gauging the public's willingness to tolerate injustice. The muted response, the pervasive silence, emboldened those who sought to further erode the rights of the vulnerable. The incremental nature of the oppression, the gradual tightening of the noose, lulled many into a false sense of security, convincing them that the worst was yet to come. In the quiet corners of homes, amidst hushed conversations, anxieties began to fester, fueled by the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. The subtle signs of impending doom cast a long shadow, darkening the landscape of their lives. Yet, amidst the growing darkness, a flickering ember of defiance persisted. While pockets of resistance flickered in the shadows, the vast majority of the populace remained passive, choosing to avert their gaze, to ignore the injustices unfolding around them. The motivations were complex, a tangled web of fear, self-preservation, and a disturbing willingness to prioritize personal comfort over moral principle. Many were not fervent supporters of the regime, not true believers in its twisted ideology, but rather pragmatists driven by a desire to maintain their livelihoods, to protect their families from harm. They convinced themselves that silence was a form of protection, that complicity was a necessary evil in a world gone mad. Others, seduced by the promises of stability, blinded by the illusion of economic prosperity, willingly embraced the new order, turning a blind eye to its darker aspects. For them, the allure of security outweighed the cost of their freedom. The Gestapo, the regime's secret police, became the instrument of fear, its insidious reach extending into every home, every workplace, every corner of society. The very fabric of community was unravelling as neighbours, colleagues, and even family members turned against one another, driven by suspicion, envy, or the chilling desire to curry favour with the authorities. The state's surveillance apparatus was not the sole source of oppression. Ordinary people became agents of control, policing each other, reporting perceived transgressions, contributing to the climate of fear and distrust. The bonds of loyalty, the ties of friendship, were strained to the breaking point, replaced by a pervasive sense of paranoia. In a parallel manoeuvre, the architects of the new order courted the support of the business elite and the military establishment, offering them a tantalizing bargain: stability, the elimination of communism, and lucrative opportunities for economic expansion. The agreement was tacit, unspoken, but its implications were clear. They would retain their power, their influence, their wealth, as long as they did not openly challenge the regime. The alliance between political extremism and economic self-interest proved to be a formidable force, solidifying the regime's hold on power. One of the most pivotal steps in this consolidation of authority was the passage of the Enabling Act, a piece of legislation that granted the head of state the power to enact laws without the need for parliamentary approval. This was the formal dismantling of democracy, the unequivocal declaration of autocracy. From that moment forward, every decree issued carried the force of law, the pronouncements of a single individual shaping the destiny of an entire nation. The judicial system, once a guarantor of impartiality, was transformed into an instrument of oppression. Judges were pressured to pledge their allegiance to the leader, to interpret the law in accordance with the party line. Trials became mere formalities, devoid of any pretense of fairness. The law was no longer a constraint on power, but a tool to reinforce it, to legitimize the regime's excesses. Punishments became increasingly draconian, meted out with arbitrary cruelty. Individuals were imprisoned without evidence, disappeared without a trace, their fates unknown to their families, their names erased from public memory. Universities, once centres of intellectual freedom, were purged of dissenting voices. Professors who refused to conform to the regime's ideology were expelled, their careers ruined, their reputations tarnished. Students, caught up in the fervour of the movement, participated in public book burnings, convinced that they were cleansing German culture of subversive influences. The speed of the transformation left many reeling, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the changes, unable to mount effective resistance. Within a matter of months, the landscape of their lives had been irrevocably altered. The streets teemed with symbols of the new order, the leader's image adorning every public building, every school, every storefront. Neutrality was no longer an option. One was either with them or against them, a collaborator or a dissident. The constant parade of uniforms, the ubiquitous flags hanging from every balcony, the mandatory salutes were not mere displays of pomp. They were chilling reminders of who held the reins of power, who dictated the terms of existence. Even at private gatherings, at weddings, funerals and family reunions, party slogans, patriotic speeches and compulsory salutes were incorporated, as if they had always been integral to German tradition. But still, a subtle resistance brewed in the hearts of the few. The insidious manipulation extended even into the realm of faith. Although the churches were not immediately abolished, they were subjected to relentless pressure, their autonomy undermined, their influence curtailed. Some pastors, driven by ambition or fear, collaborated with the regime, tailoring their sermons to align with the prevailing ideology. Others, defiant in their convictions, were silenced, their voices stifled, their congregations left adrift. Even religious youth organizations were absorbed or banned, replaced by state-sponsored groups that promoted the regime's values. In rural areas, where traditional values held sway and skepticism towards rapid change was deeply ingrained, propaganda faced a more formidable challenge. Yet, even there, the relentless pressure, the insidious allure of conformity, eventually took its toll. Farmers were offered incentives to join party organizations, promises of benefits, protection, and enhanced social standing. The path of obedience, though morally compromising, seemed far easier than the path of resistance. The arts, too, were subjected to ideological scrutiny. Painters, writers, and musicians who refused to adhere to the party line were labelled as degenerate, their works banned, their careers destroyed. Cinema became a powerful tool of propaganda, its carefully crafted narratives presenting a heroic image of the nation while demonizing its perceived enemies. Mandatory screenings were held in schools and factories, ensuring that no one could escape the pervasive message. Within a short span of time, a climate of pervasive distrust had taken root, poisoning relationships, severing bonds of loyalty. Friends of long standing ceased to communicate, fearing that their words might be twisted, that their confidences might be betrayed. Individuals who had once shared progressive ideals now parroted official slogans, driven by a desperate need to protect themselves, to shield their families from harm. It became commonplace to accept what had once seemed unthinkable, to rationalize the erosion of fundamental rights, to accommodate the ever-increasing demands of the regime. Some clung to the hope that this was merely a temporary aberration, a fleeting phase that would soon pass. But with each new law, with each incremental step towards totalitarian control, the illusion of transience faded, replaced by the chilling realization that this was the new reality. Promises of order, employment, and economic recovery proved seductive, convincing many that stability was worth the price of their freedom. Street posters, marches, and slogans repeated ad nauseum created an illusion of national unity, a full sense of collective purpose. State-funded employment programs yielded tangible results, transforming the landscape with new highways, public buildings, and factories. Unemployment plummeted, bolstering the regime's legitimacy, convincing a large segment of the population that the system was in fact working. They chose to ignore the hidden cost, the insidious repression, the pervasive control, the elimination of all dissenting voices. Everyday life underwent a subtle but pervasive transformation. In schools, regime hymns were sung every morning, indoctrinating the youth from the moment they entered the classroom. In shops, signs were posted, subtly discouraging patronage of businesses owned by those deemed undesirable. At home, children repeated phrases they had learned at youth marches, echoing the party line without fully comprehending its implications. Parents, fearful of their children's innocent indiscretions, hesitated to speak freely in their own homes, lest their words be reported to the authorities. Portraits of the leader adorned postcards, newspapers, and even children's games, transforming him into an omnipresent figure, an inescapable presence in their lives. National celebrations proliferated, becoming mandatory events, attendance carefully monitored, non-participation viewed with suspicion, potentially carrying dire consequences. Everything was meticulously designed to reinforce the perception that the regime was invincible, eternal, its power absolute. Those who dared to protest, even through subtle gestures of defiance, were swiftly and ruthlessly crushed. Intellectuals who attempted to disseminate dissenting ideas through clandestine writings were discovered, punished, their voices silenced. Many fled the country, seeking refuge in distant lands, but others were denied that opportunity, trapped within the regime's iron grip. The repression was so effective, so chilling in its execution, that a mere handful of public examples sufficed to compel the majority to embrace silence. The regime did not require an army of secret agents to maintain control. It was enough that everyone believed they were being watched, that every word, every action was subject to scrutiny. That constant sense of being observed paralyzed any attempt at dissent, stifling the flames of rebellion before they could ignite. When absolute power was finally consolidated, there was no longer any need to feign democracy. Elections became meaningless rituals, devoid of any genuine choice. For many, it was no longer perceived as a dictatorship, but simply the new reality, the new paradigm, an existence predicated on unquestioning obedience, a life subsumed by the worship of the machine that controlled everything. Still, as the darkness deepened, the murmurs of resistance grew louder, echoing in the shadows of society. The Nazi regime, with ruthless efficiency, wasted no time in constructing an unprecedented surveillance network, an intricate web of spies and informants that permeated every level of society. From its nascent stages, specialized agencies were established, their sole purpose to identify and neutralize perceived enemies of the system. The Gestapo, a secret police operating without the constraints of uniforms or legal boundaries, was tasked with hunting down anyone suspected of opposing the party. They did not require evidence, only suspicion. A mere accusation, whispered in the shadows, was sufficient to trigger an arrest, to condemn an individual to imprisonment without trial, without recourse to justice. The very foundations of trust crumbled as people began to fear their own neighbours, their own friends, their own families. An anonymous report fueled by malice or envy could lead to a disappearance, a life irrevocably altered. Homes were raided in the dead of night, the sanctity of private life violated, the tranquility of families shattered. Detainees were often transported to unknown locations, their fates shrouded in mystery. Many never returned, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the regime. Those who did emerge from the shadows were transformed, their spirits broken, their voices silenced by fear. No one dared to inquire about their experiences. No one dared to delve into the horrors they had witnessed. Most citizens remained willfully ignorant, preferring the comfort of denial to the harsh reality of their surroundings. The identities of those who served the Gestapo remained shrouded in secrecy. They could be the butcher, the teacher, even a trusted friend. That uncertainty, that constant suspicion, kept everyone in a state of perpetual unease, stifling dissent, eroding trust. People ceased to discuss politics openly, confining their thoughts to the privacy of their own minds. Within the walls of their homes, voices were lowered, conversations hushed, as families tiptoed around sensitive topics. Children, while taught to respect the regime, were also subtly encouraged to report anything unusual they overheard, transforming them into unwitting informants, extensions of the state's surveillance apparatus. Other groups complemented this system of control, the SS and the SA patrolling the streets, intimidating dissenters and punishing those who dared to step out of line. While theoretically distinct entities, they collaborated seamlessly in the suppression of opposition. Civilian spies, ordinary citizens who collaborated with the authorities out of conviction or fear, further strengthened the web of surveillance, transforming society into a self-policing entity. Concentration camps, initially conceived as detention centres, became instruments of terror, designed to imprison those deemed dangerous to the regime. These were not merely criminals, but also those who deviated from the prescribed ideology. Journalists, teachers, activists, and ordinary individuals who dared to speak their minds. Initially, only a few camps existed, but over time they multiplied, their shadows, stretching across the landscape, a constant reminder of the consequences of non-conformity. These were places of unimaginable cruelty, where mistreatment was rampant, where human life was devalued, where hope withered and died. One did not need to belong to a political organisation to find oneself incarcerated. A careless remark, a whispered joke, was enough to trigger an arrest. Even listening to foreign radio broadcasts seeking information from outside the regime's controlled narrative could be deemed an act of treason. For many, silence became the only viable option. Even those who harboured deep reservations about the regime preferred to remain on the sidelines, to avoid attracting attention, to protect themselves and their families from harm. Resistance was minimal, as the cost of defiance was too high, the consequences too dire. The system was designed to crush any attempt at rebellion, to extinguish any spark of dissent. There was no space for protest, no avenue for redress. The streets were constantly monitored, rumours of arrests spread like wildfire, amplifying the climate of fear. The source of terror was not only what was visible, but also what was imagined, the horrors that lurked in the shadows, the unknown atrocities that took place within the walls of prisons and camps. Stories, often embellished, were whispered in hushed tones, carefully guarded secrets. No one knew the full extent of the depravity, but everyone assumed it was best not to find out, to avoid any contact with the darkness. The very uncertainty, the pervasive ambiguity, served as another weapon in the regime's arsenal. Terror was invisible yet omnipresent, a constant companion that shadowed every thought, every action. The mere sight of an officer's uniform was enough to command respect, to elicit immediate compliance. People learned to avert their gaze, to respond in monosyllabic phrases, to avoid raising their voices. Interrogations were feared, even by those who had nothing to hide. The pressure, the manipulation, the sheer exhaustion could lead individuals to confess to crimes they had not committed, to betray their own principles in a desperate attempt to escape the nightmare. The regime utilized the media to reinforce this atmosphere of fear, publishing detailed accounts of arrests and punishments. The specific reasons for the arrests were often obscured, but the message was clear. No one was beyond the reach of the state. No one was immune from its wrath. This overt display of power served as a chilling warning, a constant reminder that the system did not forgive mistakes, that it did not tolerate distractions. Citizens were encouraged to monitor one another, to report any perceived deviation from the party line. In many neighborhoods, local party leaders organized meetings, meticulously recording the activities of their neighbors, scrutinizing their behavior. Those who failed to participate in official events, such as parades and regime celebrations, were viewed with suspicion, their loyalty questioned. Not attending a march, not displaying a flag in the window, could be interpreted as an act of rebellion, a sign of disaffection. The same system of control was implemented in workplaces where employees knew they were being watched, where political overseers were appointed to monitor their conversations, to report any inappropriate remarks to the authorities. Independent unions were dismantled, replaced by state-controlled organizations, ensuring that workers demonstrated unwavering obedience not only in their tasks, but also in their thoughts. Private life was shrinking, becoming increasingly vulnerable to scrutiny. Marriages were observed, friendships analyzed, large family gatherings viewed with suspicion. People lived with a constant awareness of being watched, of being judged. Many burned letters, hid books, purged their homes of anything that could be deemed incriminating. Self-censorship became ingrained in daily life, a subconscious filter that stifled spontaneous expression. People learned to hesitate before speaking, to consider the potential consequences of their words. Foreigners residing within Germany were also placed under intense scrutiny, their embassies and residences subjected to constant surveillance. Diplomatic personnel reported back to their home countries that the atmosphere was oppressive, that Germans were afraid to speak freely, that a pall of fear hung over the nation. Visitors were received with caution. Conversations with Germans terminated abruptly when sensitive topics were broached. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were not exempt from this control. The regime dictated what could be painted, what could be written, what could be shown on the screen. Books were reviewed, censored, and many were removed from bookstores, their pages deemed dangerous, their ideas subversive. Copies were publicly burned, a spectacle designed to send a clear message. There was only one truth, and it belonged to the party. Those who persisted in expressing dissenting viewpoints were silenced, exiled, or detained, their voices extinguished. Universities underwent a radical transformation. Professors who espoused unorthodox ideas were expelled, their careers ruined. Courses were restructured to promote the regime's ideology, critical thinking replaced by rote memorization. Schools became tools of indoctrination, their curricula designed to mold young minds into unquestioning followers of the party line. Religion, too, was placed under constant surveillance. While churches were not explicitly banned, they were expected to cooperate, to align their teachings with the regime's values. Some religious leaders, succumbing to pressure or driven by opportunism, embraced the new order, while others attempted to resist, their voices faint but defiant. Those who openly opposed the regime were arrested, pressured into silence, their congregations left leaderless. It was taught that the leader was the true guide, that faith must conform to the dictates of the state. Sermons were monitored, temples watched, any sign of dissent swiftly suppressed. Those returning from abroad were subjected to intense interrogation, their travels scrutinized, their contacts investigated, their beliefs questioned. travelling abroad became increasingly difficult, requiring extensive documentation, elaborate justifications. Even within the country, moving without permission could arouse suspicion, triggering inquiries from the authorities. The state sought total control over every citizen's movement, every aspect of their lives. In small towns where everyone knew each other, the system of control was even more pervasive. Any change in behaviour, any deviation from the norm drew immediate attention. There did not need to be a policeman present. An inquisitive neighbour, fueled by gossip or suspicion, was sufficient to trigger an investigation. A culture of denunciation flourished, where petty grievances and personal rivalries could have devastating consequences. The media played a crucial role in amplifying the climate of fear, publishing weekly reports of arrests and punishments, subtly reminding the populace that no one was safe, that any transgression, no matter how minor, could have dire consequences. Radio broadcasts repeated slogans ad nauseum, while films portrayed spies and saboteurs betraying the nation, reinforcing the message that dissent was synonymous with treachery. In this way, society was reshaped through surveillance and punishment, its citizens transformed into informants, its bonds of trust severed, its spirit broken. People ceased to trust one another, retreating into themselves, their voices silenced by fear. Silence and obedience became the only viable path to survival. The fear was not merely of the Gestapo, of the concentration camps, but also of the neighbour, the friend, even of oneself. The insidious knowledge that one's own thoughts could be deemed treasonous, that one's own words could be used against them, created a climate of pervasive anxiety, a constant state of self-censorship. In the face of such overwhelming oppression, the spirit of resistance flickered, threatened but not extinguished, waiting for an opportunity to ignite. As soon as the regime consolidated its power, the role it expected from women was clearly imposed, assigning them a key mission in the construction of the nation to become mothers. Children, kitchen, and faith, the slogan repeated in posters, official speeches, and classrooms, left no room for doubt. The female ideal promoted was that of a woman devoted to the home, responsible for raising the future generation and keeping the house in line with the imposed rules. The state began rewarding women who had more children, awards like the Mother's Cross given according to the number of offspring, bronze for 4, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. The ceremonies were public, organised to applaud mothers as national heroines. This measure was not just symbolic, but also offered real benefits such as better housing or financial support. At the same time, women were discouraged from seeking employment, many removed from positions in offices, schools, or factories to make room for men. Universities limited their admission. Careers considered male almost entirely closed to them. Those who continued studying were viewed with suspicion, the message clear that studying was acceptable only if it didn't interfere with the duty of being a mother. Propaganda showed images of smiling women cooking, caring for children, or sewing. Women's magazines dropped fashion topics to focus on motherhood advice, traditional recipes, and ways to organise the household. Even toys changed, girls receiving toy kitchens, dolls, and games simulating domestic chores, everything designed to prepare the future mother from an early age. However, not all women accepted this role without question. Many young women, especially in cities, wanted to work, study, or live differently, but faced legal and social barriers. Speaking against the official model could have consequences. Those who insisted on leading a different life labelled selfish or unpatriotic, in some cases watched or even interrogated. Women were also integrated into official party organisations, the German Women's League bringing together women of all ages to teach them how to serve the country from their homes. Courses were offered on cooking, childcare, and sewing, but also indoctrination, teaching them about racial purity, the duty to raise healthy children, and the importance of staying faithful to the Nazi ideal. Within these organisations, surveillance was also promoted, women encouraged to report suspicious behaviour in their neighbours, Thus many became pieces of the control system, some out of conviction, others out of fear. Private life shrank and relationships among women became tense, any misinterpreted comment leading to a report. Although most roles were designed for the home, some women worked within the system as secretaries in party offices, nurses in regime health centres, and supervisors in re-education camps. Still, their advancement was limited, unable to occupy high positions or participate in key decisions, seen as assistants, not leaders. A physical ideal was also imposed, women having to be healthy, strong, and of Aryan appearance. Medical inspections were conducted before marriage, couples having to prove they were fit to have children, hereditary illnesses grounds for preventing a marriage. In the most extreme cases, the regime authorized forced sterilization, all in the name of protecting the race. This control extended to sexuality, relationships between German women and non-German men, especially those of a certain faith or foreigners, harshly punished, accused of betraying the people, some arrested, others publicly humiliated. Relationships had to be useful to the state. Any bond that didn't fit the official plans broken by force. The regime also launched programs promoting early marriage, loans made available to young couples who wanted to marry, part of the loan forgiven if the wife left her job and devoted herself to the home, encouraging a lifestyle centered on the home and reproduction through money. Despite the restrictions, some women achieved a certain visibility, some holding symbolic positions in women's organizations, others participating in social work approved by the regime, but all with a clear limit, unable to influence important decisions, politics, the economy, and the military reserved for men. Women, though visible, still had no voice of their own. During the years of peace, the model was maintained firmly, but when the war broke out, things changed, the need for labour leading the regime to modify some rules. Many women were called to work in factories, offices, or even in the fields, what had once been seen as unacceptable now necessary. Still, propaganda insisted that this was not their primary role. Those who worked did so under pressure, expected to fulfill their duties without ceasing to be exemplary mothers or wives, the double burden exhausting, expected to care for their homes after long work days, the regime offering insufficient support, everything falling on them. Even so, few complained out loud, fear and duty keeping everything silent. Women were also victims of other forms of control, some forced to participate in selective reproduction programs, paired with soldiers or party members to have children considered pure. Not all agreed, but the pressure was strong, persuaded by saying they were helping their country, in reality used as tools of the state. As the war progressed and casualties increased, it became common to see women in roles that had once been unthinkable, some driving trams, others working as guards. However, this openness was not a recognition, but an emergency measure, expected to return to the home once the war ended, not about equality, but about temporary substitution. The end of the conflict completely changed the lives of millions, many women having lost their husbands, brothers or sons, cities destroyed, having to rebuild their daily lives among the ruins. The regime had disappeared, but everything they had lived through remained, some carrying the weight of having been part of the system, others just trying to adapt as best they could. During the post-war trials, few women were brought to justice, considered minor figures, although many had actively collaborated, some managing to avoid any punishment, others receiving superficial sanctions. For decades, the role they had under the Dominion overlooked. Only much later did it begin to be thoroughly studied. What was once justified as obedience now examined as another part of the machinery. This was life at home between shortages, fear, and routine. Even then, a faint hope glimmered in the eyes of some, a silent promise of a different future. The regime's leaders recognized the importance of shaping the young from the very beginning, focusing on controlling the education system, not satisfied with minor curricular changes, but wanting total control over what children learned, thought, and valued. Teachers who continued teaching traditionally were removed or punished. only those aligned with the regime allowed to stay, many cooperating out of fear or conviction, those who didn't replaced with more reliable staff, textbooks rewritten to teach history, biology, and geography according to party interests, eliminating certain authors and introducing materials emphasizing national pride and racial superiority. In classrooms, there was constant talk of obeying leaders, being loyal to the people, and being ready to sacrifice for the fatherland. Even in math or science, examples reinforced official thinking. Students learned to distinguish between good citizens and enemies, asked to monitor what happened at home and report if parents or neighbours spoke ill of the government, making children part of the surveillance system. Education was only part of the plan, with youth absorbed into organisations, boys joining the Hitler Youth, and girls the League of German Girls, becoming mandatory through games, hikes, songs and group tasks, instilling ideals, training boys to become soldiers and leaders, and girls to be wives and mothers. The uniform was essential, showing they belonged to the movement, bringing pride but also pressure. Those who didn't wearing it singled out, affecting their families. Salutes, oaths, and chants were repeated, designed to make children feel part of a greater cause, rewarding discipline, devotion, and conformity. Tasks weren't just recreational, but also training in physical skills, survival techniques, and how to handle weapons, teaching them to serve, fight, and die for the country from a very young age. Girls were prepared to become women dedicated to the home, child-rearing, and community, learning to cook, administer first aid, and organise a household according to norms, creating a reality in which youth knew no other way, surrounded by symbols, slogans, and people repeating the same message with no room for questioning. As children grew, they were expected to pass through stages within youth organisations, moving to preparatory sections for the army or the SS, a gradual and planned process. Girls also progressed, receiving basic training and joining groups that taught childcare, home management, and community support, never encouraged to pursue futures outside their assigned roles. Social pressure was strong. Those who didn't integrate isolated, parents fearing their children labelled problematic if they didn't participate. Children themselves asking to join so they wouldn't be left out. Those who stood out received awards, named youth leaders, and allowed to represent the movement at public events, opening the door to future positions in government or the armed forces. Summer camps and trips reinforced discipline, waking up early, exercising and attending meetings discussing loyalty, sacrifice and duty, shaping youth who would never hesitate to follow orders. During free time, children were exposed to materials designed by the regime, repeating official values in movies, stories and board games, making sure everything in their environment repeated the same message. In families, some parents didn't agree with the system, but had to appear supportive to avoid trouble, while others trusted the regime and believed they were doing the right thing, growing up in an environment with no apparent contradictions. When the war began, many were so integrated into the system that they didn't hesitate to cooperate, helping with collection tasks, participating in marches, and guarding bombed properties or assisting in hospitals, with teenagers sent to accelerated training to serve as combatants, either volunteering or forced, the next step in the plan laid out for them since childhood. The psychological impact was immense, but no one allowed to talk about it, showing weakness frowned upon, encouraged to endure pain, ignore fear, and focus on duty, with no space to talk about anxiety, confusion, or sadness. In the final months of the conflict, units made up solely of youths were formed, some only 15 or 16 years old, given a uniform, a weapon, and a mission, trained to obey without question, and doing so to the end. After the defeat, the system unravelled, organisation shut down, symbols, uniforms, and salutes banned, leaving children without references, not understanding why everything they had been taught was no longer valid. Many feeling shame, others not knowing how to act, some families trying to erase everything, others remaining silent. It was a generation marked by an education